Okay, so welcome everybody to our latest Walsall Safeguarding Partnership webinar. Today we have joined with Safer Walsall Partnership to deliver to you a webinar on domestic homicide reviews, or you may hear them called DHRs today, referred to as part of the session, and the learning around these. So my name is Kellyanne Perry and I'm the Practice Improvement Lead for the Walsall Safeguarding Partnership. And I'm joined today by Ian Billam from Safer Walsall Partnership. Ian has 20 years experience in local government in strategic and senior management, public and community safety, safeguarding and regulatory services and criminal justice. So he specialises in service design, partnership, policy and strategic development, domestic homicide reviews and serious case reviews for both adults and children. I'm also joined today by Simon Hill, who is an independent reviewer and the report author. And in the last 6 years, Simon has undertaken numerous domestic homicide reviews and safeguarding adults reviews, as well as serious incident reviews. And in the West Midlands region, and he's also been the independent chair for the last 3 DHRs within Walsall. We've also joined by Jane, who you've just seen from Safer Walsall Partnership, who's going to be behind the scenes supporting with the IT side of things and moving the PowerPoint presentation on. So over the next hour and a half, they're going to talk to you about what is a DHR, the purpose of it and what the process is within Walsall. Simon will then take you through some of the learning that has been collated as part of the reviews that have taken place. After the webinar, we'll make sure that all of the slides are sent out to you all. Obviously, Jane's got all your email addresses because you've attended today. So we'll make sure that that comes over to you along with some evaluation as well, which we'll show you at the end. So just before I hand over to Ian, we've asked that you all kind of place yourselves on mute, and you can turn your cameras off if you want to. But you can interact with us today as part of the webinar by posting your questions or your comments in the Q&A box, and we'll pick these up at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Ian Billam from Safer Walsall Partnership. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much. If you put the first slide on, please, Jane. Actually, you can move it on to the next one after that. There you go. Oh, back one. There we go. There, that's the one. Lovely. Hi, everybody. I think that biography, that just means I've been around a long time, doing various things, mainly in and around community safety. What we're going to look at this morning, my part of it is I'll talk about the purpose of domestic homicide review, how we actually go through the process, a little bit of national learning. I'll give you a quick insight of a case that affected and how it affected national thinking. One I was actually involved with that people get fed up with me banging on about, but I'm going to do it today anyway. So have a little look at that, and just so you can understand why we do the reviews and what they're about. So any myths or misconceptions or preconceptions we have about those, we can get rid of today. And then Simon will kick in with his part, which is more first-hand experience, I think. So purpose of a domestic homicide review, essentially, they're about lessons that we want to learn. That's the main thing. What lessons can we learn professionally across all the organisations, and about safeguarding victims or potential victims? And that's the key to that, because the thing is, it's a domestic homicide. You can't particularly safeguard a victim, but you can safeguard potential victims of homicide and try and make it preventable. And we'll go through that. It's also about what the lessons are in and between agencies. So what we do, how we interact between each other, but also what within any single agency we may learn within that single agency that either is a good practice or something that needs to be changed or something that needs to be developed, or anything in and around that, and also the timeframes that we do those in. Key to the review as well as how we apply them. So what do we do about applying those? Is it policy changes? And make sure we effect those changes as timely as possible and do that. Prevention. You know, the whole part of the learning experience is if it's possible to prevent another domestic homicide, then that's kind of our point in the whole thing really is trying to do that and trying to prevent it. Moving on, sorry, my screen's just froze a section. Yeah, rationale, avoid future incidents. So, you know, that is a key to where we need to go. Next slide, please, Jane. I feel like pattern balance. Okay, definition. There's a definition that we've been working from. We might have tweaked or changed several times over, and the amount of times it changes, this might not even be the up-to-date one. It's the most up-to-date we have. You can see, particularly I put in bold because this is a reference to what I'm going to tell you shortly, the age 16 or over, and anybody in a relationship at age 16 or over. And that's a key point to what I'm going to highlight very shortly. Next one, please, Jane. Lovely. I'm fairly new to Walsall within that whole thing. So, you know, I've been around, I came here around June. That's, yeah, probably you can't say that, but that is our process. Essentially what that does is outline our flowchart of the time from being notified to how we make the decisions going on and making sure that all appropriate routes are followed. And you know, sometimes it isn't a domestic homicide review. If there's children involved, essentially it goes down the children's safeguarding route. That's a kind of usually a rule of thumb, but very often it can be very closely linked with a safeguard adults review, and sometimes you know you can to and fro to whether it is, and sometimes it can be a joint process and that as well. But once the process starts, it's an independent process and closed process, such for the review. So we need to make sure there isn't any external influence as such on that. It's in that independence, and the challenge is appropriate throughout the whole process. And then it goes off to the Home Office for assessment. And hopefully when it comes back to us, we publicize it. God, publish even. Put the wrong teeth in this morning. Next one, please, Jane. Lovely. Okay, national learning. And this is the key to the little case I'll highlight today. And for me, it's some of the things that people don't often think about within a review and within a domestic homicide review. And some of the key things you'll see across just about every review you're part of is the importance of information sharing, interagency information sharing, making sure that all agencies involved in a particular case or otherwise have all of the information, because any gaps can essentially cause major issues. Involving friends and family. And I think Simon will touch on this more than I will, but the importance is highlighted in anything around domestic homicide reviews, around the importance of involving friends and family. And that's a challenge in itself to be able to do that. You're dealing with a very, very sensitive, time and sensitive issue. So involving those, and then there's legal challenges that can come from that as well. But it gives you the full picture of what the issues were, the access to services, other things that were going on, and it makes sure to do it. Robust challenge. I'm very, and I think Simon might highlight this, I'm very fond of a domestic homicide review that has a robust challenge, and I think it's massively important that as partners within that panel, we are very robust in our challenge of one another, because to me, that anticipates and highlights the challenge that we've come at the end once we've written all that, and it means that we've held everybody to account and proven that accountability by making that robust challenge, and there should be no moving away from that. The other key thing for me is identifying risks. The domestic homicide review should clearly identify the risks that were prevalent, and then we would look about how those risks were managed and controlled in various other parts to that. Next slide, please, Jane. Thank you. Okay, case study, and I apologise in some part of those who've already heard me bang on about this, but it's a very important case. A case I was involved in, and it had some impact, and it'll show you the impact on the national picture. This was a woman who was struggling with a teenage son, Michael, who had some difficulties, behaviour difficulties, and it was back in 2015. Actually, the case itself wasn't published, I think, till around 2017, maybe even later than that. he was six. I would say 16-year-old son there. Actually, at the time of the offences, he was, of most of the issues, he was 15, which was where the problem started to occur. So bear that in mind, that at the time of most of the issues, he was under 16, and that will highlight the point I was talking about before around the age. Jane, can you have the next one, please? Okay, a little bit of background. Sarah, single parent, she lived with her son Michael. Michael had no contact with his biological father. There'd been stepfathers, etc., but nobody stayed the long term. Sarah held down two jobs. I've changed that as a lunchtime supervisor. It did say dinner lady. I am from the north. What would you expect? And a cleaner in a local school. And she worked very hard. Her main support, day to day and any other time, Sarah, were her parents. That's who she'll look to. She'll look to her parents for all of her support. And they played a major part. And you'll see that throughout this review, actually, they played a major part as well. Michael had, just to be clear, these are pseudonyms as well. Michael needed ongoing support for various mental health issues he had. He had no clear diagnosis. It wasn't diagnosed with autism. It was various different things going on with him, and he had different medication as we went through that. So that's the kind of background to the picture. And it might look true for a lot of domestic homicide reviews or domestic homicide issues that we've been involved in, or if you're involved in domestic abuse, etc., it might look clear to you now as well. Certainly, as we go through this, you'll see some more clarity. Next one, please, Jane. Thanks. Okay, so in terms of the terms of reference when we were looking at that review, and this is almost when you go through any domestic homicide review, you set your terms up and you look at what you're going on. For this one, it was the domestic violence and abuse, and I'm going to highlight that very shortly, and you'll see why that's, you think, well, obviously, it's domestic homicide review, but actually it wasn't that clear. Adolescent to parent violence and abuse. Now, keep that one in mind. Keep that one in mind, because that's where I'm going with this. The risk posed by Michael, very important. So just to highlight that, next slide, Jane, please. Okay, domestic violence and abuse wasn't actually recognised. So when we went through the review, what we discovered was they didn't recognise the abuse from Michael to his mum as domestic violence. What was seen, it was seen as Sarah or her mum having difficulty controlling the behaviour of a young man with issues. And that was how it was seen, and that's how it was predominantly dealt with. So they didn't recognise the adolescent parent violence and abuse. It was apparent, but it wasn't recognised. So they didn't assess the risk. Now, he's a 15-year-old lad at the time, not a small lad either. 15-year-old, if you've got teenage lads, they're not fairly strong. She was on her own. So that was how it was identified. But even, and this was the argument that went throughout the review, this is a robust challenge for you. This will come out. Even if it had been, the definition says age 16 or over. So the argument was, should have been referred to MARAC, Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference that deals with high-risk cases of domestic abuse, if you don't know, if you're not in that world. However, the discussion was then that not everybody actually, a lot of people around the table said, well, it couldn't have because he was 16. Our argument from myself and the mental health services and a couple of others argued very robustly that actually the victim was over 18. So where does it say any criteria anywhere that they couldn't have been referred? And so you get quoted in the definition. And actually the truth of the matter was it didn't say it anywhere. Not anywhere did it say it. It was just people making an assumption based on a definition, that one that I showed you, that was how you referred into the MARAC process. Very, very challenging time that was. It took a lot out of everybody in the room, and that's the robust challenge I think a domestic homicide review needs. I had someone who'd had experience of 22 domestic homicide reviews because they worked regionally, and said that was the toughest one they'd been through. So that's robust challenge for me. Next slide, please. Yeah. So as you can see, what happened was throughout the interactions with agencies, and as we went through the review, there's a lack of consideration given to Michael and his mum and how the how his behaviour changed as he used the internet. And he was always on the internet, and he would go onto these weird sites, I think. Creepypasta is a particular one. If you see that, it should raise a big red flag on you if you have children. It's associated with 2 deaths of 2 young girls in America, I think. Now, I never get the definition of it right. As such, it's a horror goth site, but what it does, and you've got to look beyond that because that means nothing. The sites that they go on, they draw you in, and the thing, essentially, the story develops and gets worse and worse to involve you into the story, into the horror, into the death. At one point, said he killed 6 taxi drivers and skinned somebody alive because this reality on the internet was a reality in his head and with his psychosis. So it was quite a problem. The controls that were suggested for his mum were, and you're probably thinking this right now, stop his access to the internet. So she did, and he basically sat on her and threw his iPad at her, and that was escalated his violence. So they hadn't seen that was, his reaction to not being allowed to do something would create a more violent situation. So that's the interplay that they hadn't looked at and hadn't considered. So the controls were about parental behavioral controls, not controls for somebody who was actually a victim of domestic abuse. So this is where it became, you could see the problem deepening, so to speak. Okay, next slide, please, Jane. So there you go, lessons that we learned. Very, very harsh ones. You can see woman with her family trying to support and protect their young son with his mental health and associated behaviour. They talked about taking him out of the home and putting him somewhere else into respite or otherwise. She categorically, throughout this whole thing, did not want him removed from the home. That to her was given in. She wanted to do what she could do with her son. So again, issues we learned from that is that actually it's not as easy as saying remove that. You've got to deal with it. How would you cope with that situation as it is, together with them in the same place, particularly in that relationship, because that was a mother to a son. So very complex. Plus his mental health issues, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that because you could see that there were some feelings in that. It was very, very. The independent management reports were some of the most honest and frank I've ever seen. Very honest. We know that's not a blame culture around domestic homicide reviews, but it was very obvious. And what happened is nobody had the full picture. Not a single agency had the full picture of what was going on. The year he killed his mum, he'd also been recognised as the most improved pupil in his school, and it was a school for young people with learning difficulties, etc., mental health needs. So it didn't all into play again. And then there were other issues around sharing between the school and the support services that just left huge gaps. So you can see that had the opportunity to take more robust intervention, it may have been preventable. Now, you never know whether you could, but the conclusion the entire panel came to, and that was the agencies involved in this, came that it may have been preventable. So very, very, very tough lesson to learn that. What I will tell you is that I mentioned Sarah's parents were her support, and they were throughout. Michael got a hospital order. He's an adult now, so I think he's 19. My maths is right, he might not be. I'll just check in to see how old I said he was on there. Sadly, the grandfather died during the review process. However, grandma still sees him, still goes to see him, still gives him support, and has just been phenomenal throughout this whole thing. So she understood his needs, and just to see that and to contemplate that, you get the importance of that. So she was there for her daughter, and she's there for her grandson, despite the horror that's happened for them in that family. So if that's a positive to take out of this one, it kind of was. Next one, please, Jane. So when I said national impact, national impact for me, and I've touched on it several times and helped highlight it. The review and recommended this, that we look at the age criteria for referral into MARAC in light of the learning from this. So around about the time that this came, ABFA became a major highlight across all of us who were working in any area of domestic abuse. ABFA became very prevalent in that. And this was the case, and you'll see it quoted nationally, I think, that kind of made sure that we did that. And that was why it was so important at that time to have that robust challenge, because without that, I don't think we'd have got to that. And it was quite a discussion, I have to say. I've not been in one since that's gone quite like that, but it does highlight. So whenever you're doing a review, remember that it's not just the impact you have on that review and those services that you're looking at that are in your area. It can be a national impact if it's something, and the learning can be important to somebody else, somewhere else, that's looking into something, and that learning can have an impact on what they're doing. It can have an impact on a service that's delivered somewhere nationally. It could even be internationally, the way the services work now. So you need to remember that it's not just on your doorstep. It's just happening across that. So you need to look a little bit beyond that. I think I've flown through this slightly quickly. My thought summary. Next slide, please, Jane. The last one. I said it throughout. Domestic homicide reviews. We've got to ensure that they're not searching for blame. They're designed to identify learning. I've been in several reviews where we've had to state clearly to agencies, and again, that part of that challenge, it's not about blame. I've even been to the point where on this review that I highlighted in here, we were doing the full learning, not the highlight that you said, and we had to tell agencies on the review, on the feedback, it wasn't about apportioning blame, because people were putting feedback in and trying to highlight some of the agencies, and that because I think they'd been highlighted a little bit, other agencies in blame. It's not about that. It's about good practice or otherwise, good and bad practice. And we shouldn't lose sight of the good practice. I think often we look at the things we need to learn and do better, but it's not just about what we do better, it's identifying what we did well. Making sure that that's embedded and remains embedded as highlighted. But somebody somewhere, and the same as we learn from other areas, and we should always be seeking to identify how it might be preventable, how we might prevent this happening to somebody else in the future. That's kind of key to it. Well, that's it from me. I think we're going to move on to Simon, who's going to give you a view from an independent chair and author's perspective, and a little bit more in depth into the learning from actual key reviews and reviews that you've had locally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. I'm hoping everybody can hear me clearly. Good morning. It's good to join a group of frontline professionals and managers to talk about the critical things that come up from domestic homicide reviews. I've actually chaired 4 Walsall domestic homicide reviews. We've got one in progress with Ian now. But I've chaired about 16 around the West Midlands in the last 6 years. What have I learned? Well, I'll try and bring as much as I can into this conversation with you guys, but do type in the comment section if you want to go back to anything later in the discussion. The first thing I've learned is humility. It isn't about blame, as Ian says, but can we go back a bit? Don't need that one quite yet. Thank you. It's about humility. It's not about blame. It's not about trying to make out that you could have sorted a problem and everybody else should have realized it. Everybody on the panel understands how difficult safeguarding and recognizing risk is. And I believe that it's all about humility. We're not judging. We're trying to think of ways of making practice better. And for me, I want to hear from 2 lots of people. First and foremost, I need to hear from the families of victims of domestic homicide to understand their perspective of what was going on. And it's a very humbling experience. I've met mums, dads, brothers, sisters, friends of people that died in domestic homicides. And I'm always struck by the dignity and resilience of people. They're often angry, but they're not vengeful. They just want to understand why this has happened. And I think it's my duty to speak to them, keep talking to them, help them to understand whatever I can help them to understand about the process, with the trial of a perpetrator, if the perpetrator is still alive, often doesn't take them away from their original position. So they are represented by often by advocates who help them understand what they're going through. There's advocacy after fatal domestic abuse, and we've worked in Walsall with several of the advocates. Often they're people that have lost loved ones themselves, and sometimes they've been well-known domestic homicides that you've read about in the paper. There's victim support. There's also 100 families who represent the families of people killed by offenders with serious mental health disorders. So these people are supporting the families that we're talking to, and they're helping us to draw out the learning. And it's a critical conversation that's occurring there. Now, I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about a group of people that are often the subject of domestic homicide reviews and have been in Walsall as well. And they're those adults with complex needs, but who may not have care and support needs under the Care Act. So these are the kind of people that come into surgeries, that come into hospitals, that will be the parents of children that you deal with. And that's one group that you meet quite frequently. And I've had 5 or 6 of the 15 or 16 reviews I've done have involved those kind of families and couples and adults. But I'm going to talk about my other little obsession, which is coercive control, because coercive control is such a central part of domestic homicides, where domestic abuse is the central theme, that if you don't understand it, and if you don't understand how a coercive controller controls the family and friends and the victim, as a professional, it's very hard to know how to engage with that family and how to do something effective with them. Yeah. So I think we can probably go on to the next slide. So when I was asked to do this, I kind of took out a piece of paper and I scribbled down some notes, and this is a kind of like a version of it now, and I'll quickly explain what I'm on about here. Domestic homicides represent the horrible tip of a massive iceberg. And even the ones that end in domestic homicides are rarely, in my experience, and this is my personal experience, cases that were at the highest level of risk known to MARAC, to the multi-agency risk assessment conferences. In other words, if they involved domestic abuse, they were beneath the radar, known to so few services. And are they therefore representative? Can we learn from them? Yes, we can, because the coercive controlling behaviour in so many DHRs and behind the domestic abuse is being experienced by thousands and thousands of women. And I will say women advisedly, and you're willing, I'm quite happy to be challenged about that later, but thousands and thousands of women are living with the impact of coercive control for days, weeks, months, years. So DHRs represent the horrible end result for some of those people, but for the vast majority, it's frontline professionals need to learn from DHRs about the worst possible scenario, but be realistic and understand that the vast majority of victims are living with this controlling behaviour, and we need to help families and the victims themselves understand what coercive control is doing in their lives, because one of the key themes that comes out in domestic homicide so often is that victims and their families don't recognise coercive control as domestic abuse because they imagine that the only domestic abuse that really matters is ones with physical violence. Well, there are plenty of coercive controllers who don't use physical violence but control the family without it. So you'll see those two little arrows. The first group then are the people I want to talk about very briefly, but it's very significant. So these are adults with complex needs. Sometimes they have present in their life the dual diagnosis, which is alcohol and mental health concerns, and you're never quite sure which came first. And there may well be even the toxic trio. So you've got domestic abuse, alcohol or mental health concerns all together, and time after time reviews have shown that where those are there, that's a very high level of risk. But quite often there are conversations that are had with professionals, and we discuss these adults with complex needs, and we talk about their mental health, their depression, their anxiety. But so often in reviews you'll find there's not actually diagnosed mental health concerns, or at least it's been anecdotally passed from one professional to another that they've got depression or anxiety that is part of the picture, but we've not got direct mental health involvement. So in relation to almost all DHRs that I've ever conducted, one of the first things that struck me is that perhaps the most important professional, although everybody who safeguards or works with families is important, but the fact that the group that have the most frequent contact with those DHR cases that have not come to police notice, not been high profile, not at high levels of risk, are GPs. And if I had two mottos for GPs, the first would be ask the question. When somebody presents with the signs that could be domestic abuse, and they're very well documented for GPs and everybody else, please ask the question, because every window of opportunity that any of us get to find out about the impact of domestic abuse on victims is critical. And GPs still, in a Walsall DHR and in other DHRs I've done, still shy away from asking about domestic abuse when there's such clear signs in front of them where a woman presents with depression or even physical injury. If at first you don't succeed, try again. If a woman doesn't understand she's the victim of domestic abuse, then you have to think of different ways of asking the question. Domestic homicide reviews that involve coercive control nearly always involve the victim being humiliated. Anecdotally, one of the earliest Walsall DHRs I did involved a woman whose husband and whose whole family didn't recognise she was a victim of domestic abuse and coercive control, but they did recognise when she was being humiliated. And I remember the family telling me they could not believe that at the funeral of their stillborn child, the coercive controlling partner ridiculed and mocked her as stupid in front of her family at the funeral of their child. So one GP once said to me, do you know the question I ask women? Does he make you feel good about yourself or pretty terrible? And I suddenly struck me, given that humiliation forms so much part of coercive control, that's a great question to start to understand what people are going through. I'm going to talk now about that first group I talked about, those complex needs adults. And I'm going to talk about a case that involved a couple called Claire and Gordon, where Gordon was the victim. But they were the kind of couple that were constantly coming to attention of police and everybody else. And I suspect time after time, people went, oh, no, not Claire and Gordon again. Next slide, please. So remember, Claire and Gordon assaulted each other, had significant alcohol problems, and they were presenting in front of a GP on a regular basis. So this is a RCGP, Royal College of General Practitioners slide. This is the guidance they give to GPs to remind them of the impact of controlling behaviour. Domestic violence and abuse can be compared to a chronic condition where clinicians are supporting the patient and encouraging self-management. The difference with patients experiencing domestic violence is that the perpetrator is in the background, undoing and sabotaging all the good work being attempted by the clinician and the patient. Now, this message is as relevant for GPs, but it's also relevant for any of us that are trying to work with somebody who's a victim of domestic abuse. And I'm utterly convinced coercive control forms a significant part of every story of domestic abuse. Well, then in that case, this is relevant to any of us trying to understand what's going on in that victim's life, because somebody behind the scenes is trying to make sure that we're not effective in working with that person. Okay. Yeah, next slide, please. So, I'm talking now about adults who haven't got care and support needs, so they will not meet the criteria for adult social care involvement. Gordon and Claire were in a volatile relationship. This is an early DHR for Walsall, and it's quite a few years old now, but it's still relevant because these kind of DHRs come up time after time after time. They were in a volatile relationship, was characterized by both of them abusing alcohol. Every year was punctuated by a succession of domestic assaults on each other. They would fight with each other, they would fall over drunk, they would get the medical conditions associated with domestic assaults and alcohol. They experienced depression, they both saw their GP. In those years, no one ever asked the one or the other whether they were the victims of domestic abuse. Why am I still talking about that now? Because that still happens today. There was the trio of vulnerabilities, all the signs warning professionals, this is a volatile combination of mental health, alcohol and drugs. Alcohol and domestic abuse. They would separate, but they were inextricably drawn back together. And strangely, they seemed to get into an assault every time they met again at Christmas. So they would separate, meet at Christmas, and then there would be another domestic abuse incident. But they were always below the threshold, or policing at that time didn't recognise the need for victimless prosecutions. So they were a problem to themselves. They were a risk to each other. One of them was going to end up, and in this case it was Gordon, seriously injured or killed. But they didn't meet domestic abuse criteria. They didn't meet adult safeguarding criteria because they didn't have care and support needs. So who was going to look at all these combined factors and try and figure out what trauma, what experiences have led them to the position they're in, and how do we address that? And I put in the report that when domestic abuse thresholds aren't met, professionals are rarely challenged to look beyond the specific incident at the whole situation and anticipate other forms of risk. Even if they had, there'd be no obvious forum at which those risks could be addressed if the individual didn't fit the criteria for an adult at risk, leading to adult safeguarding referrals. So they won't go to MARAC because they're not high enough risk. They're not going to be an adult safeguarding risk because they haven't got care and support needs, but they've got vulnerabilities that are taking them down a path to disaster. How do we sort that out? Well, in a Wolverhampton DHR I did, we looked at concerns meetings. And the protocol in Wolverhampton, which I think makes sense, is that where professionals have mounting concerns about a adult who may not have care and support needs, but has complex medical, mental health, domestic abuse issues, then any professional should be able to call a concerns meeting and an MDT or a discussion, which may be an hour's work. And as we sit here on Teams, the one thing that's come from COVID for me is stop driving to people's offices, because that makes meetings impossible. We can all do this. We can have that MDT sat in our home, sat in our office. But the hour we spend discussing Gordon and Claire may be a life-saving decision, because we may be able to think of strategies that will make us think, instead of, oh no, not Claire and Gordon. When we hear something's happened, we'll be thinking, oh no, not Claire and Gordon, because we understand the level of risk. So that is that group, which I've had about 5 of my domestic homicides have been that type, where there's domestic abuse and some element of coercive controlling behaviour, but it isn't a central element because there was abuse by one party of the other. But I suspect the physical differences in power meant it was Gordon who died at Claire's hands because of the frustration she felt living with him. Okay, next slide, please. So, I hope I'm okay for time. I think we've had about 16 minutes. Everybody, managers and frontline staff, need to understand the mindset of a coercive controller, because actually I say a lot, I would say 90% of domestic abuse has coercive control built into it, as hot-wired into it. Yeah. And if that's the case, we really need to understand how the mind of a coercive controller works, because it'll inform our training. It'll inform how we deal with families that we've got worries about. It'll help us to understand a coercive controller in our midst. Lundy Bancroft is considered to be somebody who understands better than most why coercive control is so powerful, because he works with perpetrators. But he doesn't work with perpetrators regardless. He works with them. Some of them have been sentenced in America to a program. Others have volunteered to come. But he's only interested in the view of the victim. What has that coercive control meant for the victim? And he wrote a book, which I can't recommend too highly, called Why Does He Do That? The question being asked by women when they speak to Lundy: if he loves me as much as he says, why does he do that? And Lundy Bancroft's answer is that coercive controllers have a mindset that makes them choose to control and humiliate and isolate their victims. So he says, in one important way, an abusive man works like a magician, distracting your attention so you won't notice where the real action is. He draws you into focusing on the turbulent world of his feelings to keep your eyes turned away from the true cause of his abusiveness, which lies in how he thinks. So he might tell you that the reason he's violent is because he was abused as a child. That's a there's no evidence really that people abused as a child, sexually or otherwise, become abusers in adult life. Because if that was true, then psychotherapy ought to be able to help people who have experienced that kind of trauma. And Lundy Bancroft's view is he's never met anybody for whom psychotherapy, who are coercive controllers, has actually helped. It's because he's got mental health problems. And I've mentioned mental health. Mental health won't make you an abuser, but mental health with an abusive mindset makes for a very bad cocktail of combinations. So why does he think the way he thinks? Because if you understand that, you understand a lot about coercive control. Okay. Next slide, please, Jane. Oh, go back one. So Lundy Bancroft says, and this is a learning from so many reviews, the abuse grows from attitudes and values, not feelings. So he will try to make you think he can't control his anger because he's experienced, his jealousy is caused by bad experiences with other partners. He'll try to deflect your attention away like that magician, but his value system is that his wife, his children, his family belong to him. So the roots of his thinking are, I own my family, they should do what I expect of them. The trunk of the tree of abuse is entitlement. As the husband and as the father in this family, I am entitled to expect certain things from my wife, and that those entitlements are the basis of what I do, because I'm protecting my rights, my expectations of what a good wife should do for me. So I've got an entitlement, and we'll talk about what those entitlements are in a moment, because it helps you to understand why does he do it. And then the branches are control. So the multitude ways, stalking, harassing, watching, belittling, humiliating, financially controlling, all of those branches are the control that keeps that family locked down, not sharing their experience with you, not even recognizing that they're suffering domestic abuse. But it's their value system that's unhealthy, not their psychology. This is not a mental health problem. The things that these coercive controllers are doing to their victims over days, weeks, months and years are choices. They are not reactions to their feelings. Everything they do is planned. Okay. Next slide, please. So probably the most influential person to describe coercive control is Evan Stark. And he talks about these 3 R's. So men who enjoy the kind of habits of mind that Lundy Bancroft has just talked about think they're entitled to continually assess what their partners think and feel, how they behave, how they use their personal time and resources. Time after time, time after time, when I speak to families, you recognize all of those elements in what they hear, so on what they say. So the things they did to isolate that victim, the things they did to drive the family away, sitting glumly staring at them when they come to dinner until they feel so uncomfortable that they go, or sniping at the mother-in-law or the father-in-law, having a go at them constantly, so that eventually they feel unable to come to the house because the tension is so palpable. So isolation is part of it. They will judge righteous behavior. The coercive controller becomes the arbiter of what's moral behavior in his wife. So in so many DHRs, women are controlled about what they wear, who they speak to. They're victims of jealous reactions. But these coercive controllers believe that they're reasonable, and they contrast constantly the emotional response of the woman to their own reasonable behavior. So they stay calm and rational in the face of a hysterical woman who is actually suffering abuse. So the abuse provokes anger, fear, hysteria, and the victim is left looking diminished, whereas the perpetrator is able to stand back and look reasonable and rational in front of police officers, in front of child protection investigators, in front of almost everybody. And their great skill is to appear rational, reasonable and charming to everybody but the family that they're manipulating. So they may well come across great. They may well seem like the perfect dad, but beneath the surface, that family is being held in control. Okay. Lundy Bancroft talks to perpetrators and says this to them: you want your partner to be this compass and you want to be north. No matter where the compass goes or what she's doing or what's on her mind, you expect her always to be focused on you. I remember in a Walsall DHR when the family were trying to describe what he was like to live with the perpetrator, and there was no physical violence. There was no physical violence that they knew of, but he would drink his cans of beer and chuck them over his shoulder, and she was expected to clear up behind him as he was doing it. He would expect certain things when he came home, and if they weren't there, all hell would kick off. And so many times I've met domestic homicide review families who have said he would constantly phone up if she was here and say, there's a disaster, come home, you need to sort this out. The washing machine's broken and you shouldn't have left it like this. You need to come back, or this has happened, that's happened. They were never good reasons. They were simply, he expected total focus on his needs. And one of the most extraordinary examples of that is in the book of Luke and Ryan Hart, whose father was a massive controller, who had prostate cancer, which was completely cleared up. But when his wife was diagnosed with cancer, he went mad because it was going to affect his rehabilitation from his cancer. And the whole family was expected to feel sorry for him. It's a classic example of what Lundy Bancroft's on. It's a totally self-centered, selfish mindset where the abuser is the most important family in the family, and the wife and children should be answerable to his needs. And the entitlements that he's getting, oh, go back one, sorry. So the entitlements he's getting are vast. Why does he do it? Because if you could get, if your partner was loving and kind and sensitive, wouldn't you get all these wonderful things, the care and support that you want? But what he wants is his entitlements without any responsibility. So he expects to be looked after, to have physical caretaking, to have his meals done, his house looked after. He expects his wife or partner to recognize when he's down and work hard to keep him happy, because he spends the whole time making her think that if she could figure out what makes him unhappy, then all this abuse would disappear. Obviously, he expects sexual caretaking as well. But he most of all expects to be deferred to in every decision. So many people find that their experience of domestic abuse is coercive control, is that they're not allowed to make any decisions for themselves. One of my own colleagues, a police officer, was subject to years of coercive controlling behaviour. She said to me, I never understood how bad it was till you guys took me out for a drink. Do you remember the day after we split up? You all took us out. And somebody asked me whether I wanted red or white wine, and I couldn't answer because I hadn't been allowed to make any choice like that for so long. But she had appeared to function within the group without us being aware of just how bad that problem was. So when families struggle to understand why somebody stays with that abuser, it's because they don't understand the level of control over their mind, their decisions, their freedom. They're so isolated. Yeah. But the other thing that coercive controllers expect is a total freedom from accountability. They should never be challenged. They should never have to account for what they've done. They should never have to apologize, because it is their family who should be answerable to them, never the other way round. So if you think about those areas, think about the challenges of talking to a victim of coercive control. Thinking about the challenges of coercive control, think about how hard it is to frame the right questions so that you understand whether that victim is being subject to degradation, humiliation, isolation from family. So you need to ask questions that talk about the key elements: the humiliation, the isolation from family, the removal of decision making and choice, financial control. Have you got access to your finances? That's so important in all of this. Okay, so that's me. I'm going to get off my soapbox. I think I've probably got time now to talk about another DHR, which has got a different theme. So, like I said at the beginning, quite a lot of DHRs will feature vulnerable adults with complex needs who don't have care and support needs, who may well exhibit the signs of that toxic trio, and who I'm suggesting, if there is no mechanism because they don't meet the threshold, then we should be talking in MDTs, and GPs already organise MDTs for patients with complex needs, but we should recognise that the time spent in an MDT discussing the case and understanding what we can do to intervene effectively could be time saved in the long run. Then there are a group of domestic homicide reviews, and they're very frequent, where the family and victim don't recognise what they're experiencing is domestic abuse because of the subtlety of coercive control. Ever so many DHRs are of that type, where there's no headline abuse, there's nothing that would give it away, but tragedy strikes in a family where they thought it was an odd relationship, it was a sad relationship, but we never thought it was an abusive relationship. Not really. So recognising, helping families and victims to recognise coercive control is critical. There are also some DHRs that don't fit necessarily any particular theme, and they bring up new areas of concern. And interestingly, and I'll talk perhaps at the end about child to parent violence and abuse, because I've got a DHR that involves exactly that, just across the border from Walsall. But I'll just quickly talk about a more recent DHR. I think I've got time. We said up to 40 minutes. Are you okay with this, Ian? Are we okay to go on for another 10 minutes?
Sorry, I'm on mute here. I've got no problem with that. Don't know about anybody else.
Yeah. Okay. And I may not have time but I will refer you to a document that some of you might want to read that will round off the discussion of coercive control. But to break from it for a moment, I think it's really important to understand the person who's been the victim and to understand from the family what they're like. And most DHRs ask the family to contribute a little statement of what that person meant to them. And in our most recent DHR, there was just that kind of description of Katie, who was an elderly lady, a retired woman, but a professional woman. And this is what Katie's family said about her. Okay, next slide. She was a wonderful wife, mum, sister, auntie, grandma, and great-grandma. It wasn't just us who loved her. She had many friends and colleagues who were drawn to her and cared for her. She worked in the NHS all her working life, starting as a trainee nurse, worked her way up to the Director of Nursing Services of Sandwell. She then took early retirement, returned to the NHS as a part-time health visitor, working with the Haven in Wolverhampton with those who'd suffered domestic violence and prostitution. She was then a safeguarding professional, and sometimes people make the incorrect assumption that if you're a safeguarding professional, and this has come about in a Birmingham DHR and in this one, you sometimes imagine that Katie would have had a better handle on what constitutes risk and recognising when she was at risk. The trouble is, when the risk is coming from your own family, all the stuff that you would normally apply is so much harder. And also, perhaps you feel people will think, how can she be the victim of abusive behaviours? So it's really important to understand that no amount of safeguarding experience will help you deal when you're the victim yourself. It will help you perhaps to understand, but it makes it very hard for you to talk about it to anybody else. And if Katie recognised the risk level she was at, because she loved the perpetrator, who was her grandson, because she loved him, I suspect she wouldn't have felt able to share that concern with anybody else. So there is that thing about victims of domestic homicide, is take every opportunity to talk to them and understand what they're going through, whether they're the victims of coercive control or, as Katie was, the victim of a grandson who had, over a few years, got deeper into a mire caused by gambling addiction, gambling addiction that got to the point where it was no more fun. So he was online gambling and he was incurring more and more and more debt. And it ran in the end to the mid 20,000s. His life had been, he'd been brought up by a stepdad with his mum, stepdad and brother, who was the brother from that relationship, stepdad and mum. He had a loving family, but he always felt as an outsider at school. He felt bullied. He didn't feel comfortable in his skin, and his life didn't go the way it wanted. And he developed depression and anxiety. Now, whether the depression and anxiety started or got worse caused by his anxieties, caused by his gambling, but his debts just spiraled quietly out of control, and his family at first were unaware. They were also unaware that he had for a long time used cocaine quite heavily, and his mum supported him going to sort out his depression, but he wasn't truthful about his gambling to mental health services. He downplayed his gambling and said, "I no longer gamble." He downplayed every element of it. And he didn't mention his drug use, or at least minimized his drug use. So we had three factors in his life. He was in debt and he was gambling. He was addicted to gambling. He probably had an addiction to cocaine, and he was suffering the consequences of those in depression. He came to notice by attempting to steal from his employers, who were a warehouse, enough money, I suspect, to cover his debts. But he was caught, put on a suspended sentence, which he served in community service, and then he came home. It wasn't long after he finished that he murdered his grandmother, Katie. Nobody knows why he did it, but there is a belief that because she helped him out over the years when he was financially in trouble, it may be that he'd asked for yet more money and she had refused. But he did everything he could to cover up his offence and make it look like it had been a stranger attack. But he was convicted of that murder. The learning from that review was one that I think really struck home with me, because as a panel, we sat and discussed the case, and nobody joined those three vulnerabilities and said, those are well-documented trio of vulnerabilities that make a high level of risk. Alcohol or substance misuse is so often linked to gambling addiction, and with gambling addiction, so often comes mental health concerns. And so we started to look at what work could be done on those areas and realized, and we were a panel of representatives who hadn't realized how significant those combinations were. And that's the message I would make for us. Be aware of that if you're in mental health services, if you're in alcohol addiction, that the gambling and alcohol and mental health make for a very dangerous combination. Okay, next slide. So we talk now, and the National Responsible Gambling Strategy talks about the adverse impacts on health and well-being for the individual, the family, communities and society. And if you look at those 7 domains of harm, almost everything I've described is listed there. He had financial harm. His relationship with his family broke down. He was in conflict constantly over his inability to tell the truth. His stepfather said he was a habitual liar because he was denying his addiction. He was denying his gambling. He was denying anything that would bring focus on his problems. But he suffered massive emotional, psychological distress, as did the whole family. And his health suffered as well. He was constantly out of work or getting in trouble or getting arrested. So he was involved in criminal activity. And there is cultural harm as well, because there's a shame that attaches to problem gambling, which means you withdraw yourself from your community, you withdraw yourself from the activities that you and your family would do, and you're absent from so much of what they're doing. It's really interesting to see that those harms were so present in this case, but we as a group only realized it as we started to work through how frequently these were together. The next slide, please. So a health survey shows that where people have anxiety or depression, 47% of problem gamblers say they're moderately or severely anxious, against 20% of non-problem gamblers. And 11% of problem gamblers have a diagnosed mental health disorder. In our case, Katie's grandson had got depression and had been seen for depression and had made a couple of self-harm attempts. They gamble for the thrill of it, at least initially, and they're more likely than average to crave thrills of other kinds too, with stimulants such as cocaine, which was the perpetrator's problem, which can make the user feel more confident in their own judgment, and euphoria is linked to it. So as I say, the learning in this case was look out for those three together, because you should be anxious about the impact on their family and on their community. Okay, now one more slide. Okay, before I go, I just want to flag this up. We haven't got time to go into it now. I don't want to go over time, but this is kind of rounding it off in a way, because Jane Monckton Smith and a group of other academics and victims of domestic homicide review, family victims, tried to look at the link between homicides, and they studied 300 homicides, and stalking and harassment. And it's interesting because they identified that there was a fixation or obsessive element to so many domestic homicides, which involved surveillance and control. We had that in a Walsall case. So the trigger for the homicide was jealousy at his partner splitting up with him and finding a new partner. And he would watch the house. He would watch. He would contact the family on the internet. He was constantly watching to see what was going on. And she's talked about in her study how you will find with domestic homicides an escalation in the frequency and severity of the behaviours that they will demonstrate. And she talked about an emotional journey reaching a crisis point. But I would argue you've got to remember that this isn't an explosion of anger, or the homicides are very often planned, because what the DHRs show is that some coercive controllers, when they lose control and they sense they're losing control, a small percentage will use a homicide as the only way of regaining control. But she's very clear that stalking behaviours were present in 94% of the homicides that featured this obsessive and fixated behaviour, and control, coercive control, in 92% of them. But to end, I would say domestic homicides are not a good way of learning about domestic abuse, because they represent the worst case scenario. Think about coercive controlling behaviours as part of all domestic abuse, and you will be in a much stronger position. But don't lose sight of those side of cases that are just as significant, like the one I've just described, where the vulnerability is completely different. And don't lose sight of those complex needs adults who don't have care and support needs, but are heading down a path because of often the trio of vulnerabilities where somebody will get hurt because nobody has got a plan to support them and deal with the presenting problems. I have gone over by 5 minutes, Ian. I'm really sorry. The final slide is too small to read, but this might whet your appetite, because if you read that document, which is Jane Monckton Smith, you will see what she thinks is the psychology behind homicides, the risk markers, and the triggers for domestic homicides. I will tell you now that I'm not as convinced as Jane Monckton Smith that it can be defined that clearly, but it's a very interesting theory in relation to domestic homicides. But I hope the message I've got from you is don't fixate on the homicides. Think about the impact of coercive control in domestic abuse and the hundreds of thousands of people who live with it for months and will not be killed, but have their emotional life, their personal life crushed out of them. That's it, really. You can get rid of the slides.
Thank you very much to both Simon and Ian. I think that's been really insightful, and I hope it's sort of given people that kind of time to do some reflection. Just a quick question and answer session now. We've only had 2 questions come through, one for Ian and one for Simon. So the first one for Ian is around, they just wanted to know, the case that you said about Sarah, is that a Walsall case?
No, it's not. It's a Northumberland case, no surprise there. And I think it's from 2015, I think.
Okay. Sorry, go on, Simon.
So I don't know if Siona, I'm not sure which case she's thinking about, but I currently am chairing a domestic homicide review in Wolverhampton, Sandwell, where child-to-parent violence and abuse has come up. Now, the interesting thing about Ian's example is that was an adolescent who was on the brink of fitting within the domestic abuse definition, but was at the time below the age of 16. What you need to think about, and I think it's really interesting, and we should really all be aware of that, is that adolescent parent violence starts often in childhood. So there's been cases of child to parent violence with 9 and 10-year-olds terrorizing and assaulting their family. And it is a massive area for early help, because early help should identify the risk to the child caused by that child to parent violence. And if you look at the threshold documents, whether it's Walsall, Sandwell, Wolverhampton, it's very hard to fit child to parent violence into the current early help threshold document. So for me, the learning that we're getting is, yes, we need to recognise where it becomes domestic violence, but we also need to understand where it fits into child protection as well, and what strategies will be most effective to support the mental health of somebody like Ian's example, but also to understand what's causing, and this is trauma-informed practice, it's understanding adult adverse childhood experiences, what makes a youngster become somebody that is a threat or challenge to their parents to the point where they can't control their behaviours. So I think it's a really hot issue, and I think we'll probably, and interestingly enough, it's become particularly relevant during lockdown. So there is a lot of evidence of child to parent violence that has happened during lockdown and has brought it back into people's attention. So there are 2 sides to it. Ian's example is and the current one that I'm dealing with are not the only ones. It really is an area we need to sort out.
Thank you.
Shall I answer the other question?
Yes, and so the other question just says, could you comment on the coercive control that can impact on children's behaviour and attitude to survivors, and this person and interested in long-term support of idolisation of abuser and the intergenerational abuse of the victim?
Right, that's a complex area. If you've got a coercive controlling mindset, then your children and your wife or your partner are your property. And you will make sure that you're not undermined in any way by anybody within that family. There are various ways it's done. Some children will become victims just like their mother of that coercive controlling behaviour. They're forever treading on eggshells. They live in fear of the perpetrator's control of them, which may not be physical, but it could be, but it's fear. and they know that they have to maintain that front outside of the home, because they will be punished if people start to ask questions about their lived experience. So those children are being controlled just as effectively as the victim, their mother, and they live in fear of what could happen to their mother. So they're constantly trying to be the buffer, or and this is quite an insidious way of dealing with they become part of the control. So they're encouraged to ridicule, belittle, degrade their mother. From an early age, they're taught that mother is somebody that we can challenge, ridicule, and they become unwittingly part of the controlling behaviour. So there are so many different ways in which that coercive controller will set the child against the mother, will ridicule the mother and encourage the child to join in, will encourage children to challenge the mother as she attempts to set boundaries. There's so many ways. And the most horrible part of it for the victim is that if she tries to break away, she knows that the narrative has been set in the minds of her children. Narrative has been set that will make it sound as if she is the person who's been unreasonable, and our rational, reasonable dad was all along fine. She's the one with the mental health problem. She's the one with depression. But yeah, because she's suffering abuse and has done for years. So you do not imagine, I've completely lost any belief that a child could be in a domestically abusive, coercive, controlled household and not be victims themselves, and not be implicated sometimes in that abuse of their mother, because they don't understand that they've been made part of the mechanism of control. And it can take many facets. The danger is, you imagine that every coercive, controlling abuser will have every element the same. They don't. So, but they all have a sense of entitlement, and they want to isolate that family from people that might challenge their control. So, is it intergenerational? I was a police officer for 30 years, so I've seen domestic abuse, and I do believe that, whereas I said that the victim of sexual abuse is not going to become an abuser because of that, I do think that boys that have seen fathers control their family in using coercive, controlling tactics have been taught to recognise you can get a whole load of entitlements by using these tactics, and in adult life, I suspect sometimes visit the same tactics on their families as well. I suspect there's a danger of that bit being taught in childhood. But there are much better informed people. As I say, I've mentioned Lundy Bancroft and Evan Stark. They talk about all of these details. And Evan Stark says, I've spent years working with victims of abuse, and I still don't understand why some men choose to abuse so severely as they do. But Landy Bancroft would say it's because they get so many entitlements with it.
Thank you.
That helps.
Thank you very much. We haven't had any further questions through. Ian, one question from me really, so that people can access them, is where can the published DHRs be found? Is it on the Safe for Walsall Partnership website?
There will be. I don't think they're up there at the moment, so I think if anybody wants to see the published ones, if they just put a request into myself or Jane Murray, that's the best way at the moment, because we're undergoing some minor surgery on the website at the moment. Just to point on Simon's thing about young people as well, there's a particular school of thinking, and don't try and make me point to the appropriate research, that says that young people are hardwired in the way they think and make informed decisions by the age of 3. So if you think if they're witnessing that kind of behaviour by the age of 3 and they're hardwired and what they think is right and wrong, there's a lot of work to do from 3 onwards with young people. So, you know, it's something to think about.
Thank you very much. If you just go on to the next slide for me, Jane. So I've just popped up there the Walsall Safeguarding Partnership website and the Safer Walsall Partnership website and the access to those, and some of the information that we've spoken about today you can find on there. If you do want to pass this sort of Teams learning event on to anybody else, then the recording of this will also be placed on the Walsall Safeguarding Partnership website as well. We will be sending, Jane will send out, as I said before, all the slides from today, and she'll also be sending out some evaluation links for you. Your evaluation is really important to us. It helps us to develop further webinars and learning events, and also to understand what your experience and how, more importantly, what you've learned today, how you'll put that into part of your practice, or what you're going to do with that. So from all of us, I'd just like to say once again a very big thank you to Ian and to Simon for your time today and for that learning event and informing us as practitioners and managers across the partnership. And thank you very much for attending, everybody else. Sorry again about the technical issues at the very beginning, but I think